They say you never forget the moment your heart breaks. Mine shattered over a $3 to $70 Christmas dinner bill. I'm Nancy Williams, and I raised my son alone after his father died. I worked 2 jobs. I sold the house where I buried my dreams. I gave him everything. And on Christmas Eve, in front of a restaurant full of strangers, he looked at me and said, "Mom, maybe you can cover this one. Consider it your Christmas gift." Everyone laughed. His wife smirked. The waiter whispered that my son had planned this. I paid that bill with shaking hands and a smile I didn't feel. And as I walked out into the snow alone, something inside me died. But something else was born. Because 3 days later, my best friend died alone, disrespected, forgotten by the children she raised. And I made a promise over her grave I would never die like that. What I did next didn't just teach my son a lesson. It exposed his wife, reclaimed my dignity, and changed everything. Stay with me. Because this story ends at a table where I decide who gets a seat. My name is Nancy Williams. I'm 62 years old, a retired accountant, and for the last 7 years, I've lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Minneapolis. My husband Robert died when our son Ethan was only 15. Since then, it's just been me and the memories we built together in a life that feels both close and impossibly far away. My home isn't much to look at from the outside. It's a modest 2-bedroom with white siding that could use a fresh coat of paint and a porch that creaks when you step on it. But inside, it's warm. Every piece of furniture tells a story. The worn leather armchair by the window was Robert's favorite spot to read the Sunday paper. The quilt draped over the sofa was sewn by my mother before she passed. The kitchen table, scratched and slightly uneven, is where Ethan did his homework every night while I made dinner after my second shift at the firm. I spend a lot of time by that window now, especially in winter. There's something about watching the snow fall that brings me peace. It blankets everything in quiet, softens the edges of the world. On those nights, I let myself remember the Christmases when Robert was still here, when Ethan was small, and our house was full of laughter. I can still see him at 7 years old tearing through wrapping paper with that wild, joyful energy only children have. He'd hold up whatever gift he'd found and run straight into my arms shouting, "You're the best mom ever." Robert would be in the corner with the camera grinning like he'd won the lottery just by watching us. Those were the good years, the years before everything changed. After Robert died, I did what any mother would do. I worked. I worked until my back ached and my eyes burned. I picked up a second job doing bookkeeping for a local grocery chain just to cover Ethan's college tuition. He got into a good school, and I was so proud. I told myself the exhaustion didn't matter. The loneliness didn't matter. As long as he had a future, I could bear anything. And I did bear it. Even when he graduated and got married to Amanda, a sharp-eyed woman with expensive tastes and a smile that never quite reached me. Even when 5 years ago they needed help buying their first place, a sleek downtown condo I could never afford myself, I didn't hesitate. I sold the house Robert and I had built our life in. The house where we brought Ethan home from the hospital. The house where Robert took his last breath, holding my hand and telling me he loved me. I sold it all. And I told Ethan I'd had some savings set aside. He didn't ask questions. I didn't offer explanations. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We give quietly. We love without asking for applause. So when Ethan called 3 weeks before Christmas and invited me to dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown, my heart leapt. We usually celebrated at home, low-key, just the 3 of us. But this felt different. Special. Maybe I thought he wanted to honor me this year. Maybe Amanda had finally softened. Maybe they'd realized how much I'd given and wanted to say thank you. I made an appointment at the salon. I pulled out my only red dress, the one I'd worn to Ethan's wedding, and steamed the wrinkles out carefully. I even wrapped a small gift for my grandson, a wooden puzzle I'd made by hand, painted with care over several evenings. The night before the dinner, Ethan called again. His voice was cheerful, but there was something underneath it I couldn't quite name. "Mom," he said. "Just a reminder, the restaurant has a dress code. Try to, fit in." I laughed it off, told him I'd look presentable. But after I hung up, I stood there in my quiet kitchen, holding the phone, feeling a strange knot forming in my chest. I should have heard the warning in his voice. But back then, I still believed my son loved me the way I loved him. The call came 2 days before Christmas Eve. I was folding laundry in the living room, humming along to a carol on the radio, when my phone rang. Linda's name appeared on the screen, and I smiled. Linda had been my friend for over 20 years. We met at a church potluck shortly after Robert died, two widows navigating the strange new landscape of life alone. She understood me in ways few people did. But the moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. She was crying. Not the quiet, composed tears of someone who's just feeling sentimental, but the raw, broken sobs of someone whose heart has been shattered. "Linda, what happened?" I sat down on the couch, my chest tightening. "She kicked me out, Nancy." Her voice cracked. "My daughter-in-law. She told me I couldn't come for Christmas. Said she didn't want old people ruining the atmosphere. Can you believe that old people? Like I'm some piece of furniture they're embarrassed to display." I closed my eyes, feeling her pain as if it were my own. Linda had 2 sons, both married, both living within 20 miles of her. She'd spent her whole life raising them, sacrificing everything just like I had. And now, when she needed them most, they'd turned their backs. "Oh, Linda, I'm so sorry." "I don't even know what I did wrong," she whispered. "I just wanted to see my grandchildren. I brought gifts, I made cookies, and she looked at me like I was nothing." I tried to find the right words, something comforting, something that would ease the ache I heard in every syllable she spoke. "They don't understand, Linda. They're young. They don't see what we gave up for them. Don't let them treat you like you're invisible Nancy." Her voice turned urgent, almost desperate. "You raised them. You gave them everything. Don't let them forget that." I promised her I wouldn't. I told her Ethan was different, that he'd invited me to a nice restaurant for Christmas, that things were looking up. But even as I said it, something cold settled in my stomach. Linda mentioned she hadn't been feeling well lately. Her heart condition, the one she'd had for years, was acting up again. The stress wasn't helping. I urged her to see her doctor to take care of herself. She promised she would, though. I wasn't sure she meant it. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time staring at the phone in my hand. At least Ethan still invites me, I thought. At least I'm not like Linda, completely shut out. But was I really so different? I thought back to last Christmas. Amanda had hosted a family gathering at their condo, and I'd been so excited to go. But the day before, Ethan called to say I shouldn't come. Amanda had told everyone I was unwell and needed to rest. I wasn't unwell. I'd never felt better, but I didn't argue. I spent Christmas alone with a frozen dinner and a black and white movie, telling myself it was just a misunderstanding. Then there was the time about 6 months ago when I'd stopped by unannounced with a casserole I'd made. Amanda opened the door, but didn't invite me in. She stood there, arms crossed, and said, "Ethan needs to focus on his own family now, Nancy. You understand, right?" Her tone was polite, but her eyes were ice. I nodded, smiled, left the casserole on the doorstep, and drove home in silence. I told myself time would make things better, that Amanda just needed space, that eventually she'd see I wasn't a threat. Maybe I was wrong. On the evening of December 23rd, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, smoothing down the red dress one last time. My hair was freshly styled soft curls framing my face. I'd even put on a little makeup, something I rarely did anymore. I looked at myself and whispered, maybe this year Amanda will see me differently. I opened my jewelry box and pulled out the necklace Robert gave me on our wedding day, a simple silver chain with a small pendant shaped like a heart. It was the only valuable thing I had left, not in terms of money, but in terms of what it meant. I fastened it around my neck and felt Robert's presence with me steadying me. Before leaving, I walked to the hallway and stopped in front of the family photo hanging on the wall. It was taken at Ethan's wedding. He stood in the center, beaming his arm around Amanda. She looked stunning in her white gown, her smile perfect and practiced. And there on the far left, almost out of frame, was me. I was smiling too, but there was a distance in that photo I'd never noticed before. Amanda wasn't standing near me. She was as far from me as the frame would allow. I stared at that picture for a long moment, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Then I grabbed my coat and headed out into the cold December night. I didn't know that night would be the last time I smiled, like a mother who still had hope. The restaurant was called Lumiere, a name I had to practice pronouncing 3 times in the car before I walked in. The moment I stepped through the heavy glass doors, I knew I was out of my depth. Crystal chandeliers hung from impossibly high ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over tables draped in white linen. Every guest looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. The women wore designer dresses and jewels that caught the light with every movement. The men had perfectly tailored suits and watches that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. I clutched my small gift bag a little tighter and scanned the room for Ethan. A hostess in a sleek black dress approached me, her smile polite but evaluating. I gave her Ethan's name, and she led me through the maze of tables. I felt every eye on me. My red dress, which had seemed elegant in my bedroom mirror, suddenly felt cheap and dated. The hem was slightly frayed. The fabric didn't shimmer like the gowns around me. Then I saw them. Ethan and Amanda were already seated at a large table near the center of the room, surrounded by people I didn't recognize. Amanda looked radiant in an emerald green dress, her hair swept up in an intricate style, diamonds glinting at her ears and throat. Ethan stood when he saw me, his smile wide and warm, and for a moment, my heart lifted. "Mom, you made it." He kissed my cheek quickly, then gestured to the table. "Everyone, this is my mother, Nancy." The strangers smiled politely, murmured hellos. Amanda didn't look up from her phone. The hostess pulled out a chair for me, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was at the far end of the table, squeezed between 2 of Amanda's friends I'd never met. Ethan and Amanda sat in the center, the spotlight clearly on them. I settled into my seat, setting my purse and gift bag on the floor, trying to shake off the strange sense of displacement that had already begun to settle over me. The waiter arrived with menus, his movements practiced and smooth. Before I could even open mine, Amanda's voice cut through the conversation. "She'll just have water. She doesn't drink wine." It wasn't the statement itself that stung. It was the way she said it, loud enough for everyone to hear. Matter of fact. As if I were a child who needed decisions made for her. I opened my mouth to say I actually wouldn't mind a glass of wine, but the waiter had already moved on. Amanda was already laughing at something one of her friends said. The moment passed and I let it go. One of the women next to me, a blonde in her 40s with a sharp smile, leaned toward Ethan. "So Ethan, how's the audit going? I heard there's been some excitement at the firm." Ethan's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He glanced at Amanda, then back to the woman. "Oh, you know how these things go. Routine stuff. Nothing to worry about." He laughed, but it sounded forced. He picked up his menu and studied it a little too intently, and I caught the way his jaw tightened. I wanted to ask him what she meant. An audit? Was something wrong at work? But before I could, Amanda launched into a story about a vacation they were planning to Bali. Her voice was animated, confident, drawing everyone's attention. She talked about private villas and sunset dinners and spa treatments, painting a picture of a life I couldn't even imagine. I tried to join the conversation a few times. When Amanda mentioned the resort's restaurant, I said, "That sounds lovely. I remember when Robert and I went to—" "Oh, Nancy, you wouldn't understand," Amanda interrupted smoothly, not even looking at me. "It's a business thing. Ethan's firm has connections there." She turned back to her friends, effectively erasing me from the conversation. Ethan said nothing. He just sat there staring at his plate shoulders slightly hunched. I felt my face grow hot. I forced a smile and nodded as if I hadn't been dismissed, as if it didn't matter. But my hands were trembling as I reached for my water glass. I took a sip, the cold liquid doing nothing to ease the tightness in my throat. Around us, the restaurant hummed with life. I glanced at the other tables. Families laughing together. Couples leaning in close, sharing stories. A grandmother at the next table had her grandchild on her lap, both of them grinning at something on a phone screen. They looked warm, connected, whole. And here I was, sitting at the edge of my own son's table, surrounded by strangers, feeling more alone than I had in years. Amanda leaned toward one of her friends and whispered something. They both giggled, and I heard the word old-fashioned float across the table. My cheeks burned. I pretended I hadn't heard, pretended I was fine, pretended this was exactly what I'd hoped for when Ethan invited me. The meal dragged on. I barely touched my food. Every time I tried to speak, Amanda's voice was louder, more commanding, pulling attention away from me. Ethan glanced at the menu prices, more than once his expression tight, and I wondered if money was tighter than he let on. But he said nothing. Did nothing. Just sat there a silent participant in my humiliation. I told myself to leave, to stand up, excuse myself, and walk out with whatever dignity I had left. But I couldn't. Because this was my son. And I still loved him. And some foolish part of me believed that if I just stayed, if I just endured, maybe something would change. Then the waiter brought the bill, and everything shattered. The waiter approached our table with a small black leather folder. I assumed he would place it in front of Ethan as is customary. Instead, he walked directly to my end of the table and set it down in front of me with a polite smile. I stared at it for a moment, confused. Surely this was a mistake. I glanced up at Ethan, expecting him to reach for it to laugh and say the waiter had gotten it wrong. But Ethan wasn't reaching. He was smiling. That same wide, easy smile he'd worn all evening. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying across the table. "Maybe you can cover this one. Consider it your Christmas gift to us." The table went silent for a heartbeat. Then, as if on cue, everyone erupted into laughter. It wasn't the warm, inclusive kind of laughter that brings people together. It was sharp, performative, the kind of laughter that needs an audience. Amanda's friend, the blonde, who'd asked about the audit, leaned back in her chair and grinned. "Wow, Ethan, you're lucky to have such a generous mom." My face burned. I looked at Ethan, waiting for him to say he was joking, that of course he'd pay, that this was all some misunderstanding. But he just sat there grinning like he'd told the funniest joke in the world. Amanda placed a hand on Ethan's arm, her expression a perfect mask of faux concern. "Oh, Ethan, don't make your mom pay." She paused, her eyes sliding toward me with a glint I recognized all too well. "Unless she wants to, of course." Then she turned to me fully, her smile sharpening into something cold and deliberate. "You did raise him right, Nancy. This is what mothers do. The words hit me like a slap. I felt every pair of eyes at the table lock onto me. The blonde, the man in the expensive suit. Amanda's other friend, a brunette I'd barely spoken to all night. Even Ethan was watching me now, waiting to see what I would do. I wanted to say something, anything. I wanted to stand up and tell him this was wrong, that I'd given him everything, and this was how he repaid me. But my throat had closed. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to grip the edge of the table to steady them. I reached for my purse with numb fingers and pulled out my credit card. The leather folder felt impossibly heavy as I opened it. The bill inside was neatly printed on thick, embossed paper. $3,270. I stared at the number. It didn't seem real. I'd never spent that much money on a single meal in my entire life. I thought about my monthly budget, my utility bills, the small savings account I kept for emergencies. This wasn't an emergency, this was a performance, and I was the punchline. But I couldn't say no. Not here. Not in front of all these people. So I slid my card into the folder and handed it to the waiter, forcing my lips into something that might have resembled a smile. The waiter took it and disappeared. The table had already moved on. Amanda was talking about dessert. Someone was ordering another bottle of wine. Ethan laughed at something I didn't hear. It was as if the moment had never happened. When the waiter returned, he set the folder in front of me again. I signed the receipt with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. My signature looked like a child's scrawl. As I pushed the folder back toward him, the waiter leaned down slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, he told us earlier to make sure the bill went to you." I froze. The words didn't register at first. Then they did, and something inside me cracked wide open. This wasn't a spontaneous joke. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Ethan had planned this. He'd called ahead. He'd made sure the waiter knew exactly what to do. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. I picked up my purse and the small gift bag I'd brought, the one with the handmade puzzle inside. No one looked up. "Merry Christmas," I said quietly. No one responded. Amanda was laughing at something on her phone. Ethan was refilling his wine glass. The strangers at the table had already forgotten I existed. I walked toward the exit, weaving through tables filled with families who actually looked happy to be together. The hostess smiled at me as I passed. The cold December air hit me the moment I stepped outside, sharp and merciless. I stood there on the sidewalk, my breath coming out in small white clouds, clutching my purse to my chest. Inside the restaurant, through the tall windows, I could see Ethan and Amanda still at the table, still laughing, still surrounded by their friends. They hadn't even noticed I was gone. I walked to my car alone, got in, locked the doors, and sat there in the freezing silence, staring at the steering wheel, trying to understand what had just happened. That night, something in me quietly broke. But something else, something colder, sharper, began to rise. I don't know how long I sat in that parking lot before I finally turned the key in the ignition. My hands were still shaking. The engine coughed to life, and warm air began to trickle through the vents, but it did nothing to thaw the cold that had settled deep in my chest. The drive home should have taken 20 minutes. I stretched it to 40, taking the long way through neighborhoods I barely recognized, streets lined with houses glowing with Christmas lights. Wreaths hung on doors. Inflatable snowmen swayed in front yards. Nativity scenes glowed softly in the falling snow. It should have been beautiful. It should have filled me with the warmth of the season. But all I felt was empty. I remembered Linda's voice from just 2 days ago, broken and desperate, on the other end of the line. "Don't wait until you're dead to be appreciated, Nancy." At the time, I'd brushed it off, thinking my situation was different, thinking Ethan still cared, thinking I was lucky compared to her. Now I wasn't so sure. A tear slid down my cheek, hot against my cold skin. Then another. But I didn't sob. I didn't break down. I just wiped them away with the back of my hand and kept driving the windshield wipers, pushing snow aside in steady, rhythmic sweeps. My mind drifted back 5 years to the day I sold the house. The house where Robert and I had started our life together. The house where we'd brought Ethan home from the hospital, where we'd celebrated every birthday and holiday, where Robert had taken his last breath holding my hand. I'd stood in the empty living room one final time, the furniture already loaded into a moving truck, the walls bare and echoing. I'd held Robert's photo in my hands, the one from our wedding day, and whispered, "I'm doing this for our son. He needs this more than I need memories." I'd believed it then. I'd believed that love meant sacrifice, that being a good mother meant giving until there was nothing left. I thought about all those nights working 2 jobs after Robert died. Coming home at midnight with my back aching, my eyes burning, barely able to stand. But I couldn't rest. Not when Ethan's tuition was due. Not when he needed textbooks or lab fees or a new laptop. I gave him everything I had because I thought that's what mothers were supposed to do. Amanda's voice echoed in my head, sharp and mocking. "You did raise him right. This is what mothers do." She was right. I had raised him. I'd raised him to think it was acceptable to humiliate the woman who gave him everything. I'd raised him to value appearances over integrity. I'd raised him to believe that love was something you took, not something you gave back. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the snow was falling harder, blanketing everything in white silence. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at my small, modest house. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it was all I had left. Inside, I dropped my purse on the kitchen table and pulled out my wallet with trembling fingers. I opened it slowly, already knowing what I'd find. $347 in cash. That was all that remained of this month's budget. And the credit card I'd just used maxed out. Completely maxed out. It would take me months to pay it off, months of eating less, spending nothing, sacrificing even more than I already had. I walked to the bathroom and flipped on the light. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized. 62 years old. Hair that had once been dark and vibrant, now streaked with gray. Lines etched deep around my eyes and mouth. My red dress, which had seemed so elegant hours ago, now looked worn and tired. I looked worn and tired. But as I stared at my reflection, I noticed something else. Something in my eyes. The pain was still there, yes. The hurt was still raw. But underneath it, something had shifted. There was a coldness now, a clarity, a quiet, steely resolve. I pulled out my phone and dialed Linda's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Her cheerful, recorded voice felt like a ghost from another lifetime. "Hi, you've reached Linda. Leave a message, and I'll call you back." The beep sounded, and I took a breath. "Linda, it's Nancy. I need to talk to you. Something happened tonight, and My voice caught. "I just need to hear your voice. Call me when you can." I hung up and set the phone on the counter. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint whistle of wind outside. I looked at myself in the mirror one more time. For 62 years, I'd been taught that love meant enduring, that being a good mother meant suffering in silence, that sacrifice was noble and complaints were selfish. But standing there in my tiny bathroom, my wallet empty and my heart hollow, I realized something I should have understood a long time ago. It wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. And clarity, I learned, is far more dangerous than rage. The call came on the morning of December 28th. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at the stack of bills I couldn't afford to pay. The phone rang, and I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. "Is this Nancy Williams?" The voice was female, older, hesitant. "Yes, this is Nancy. My name is Carol Henderson. I'm Linda's neighbor." There was a pause, and in that pause I felt the air leave my lungs. "I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Linda passed away sometime last night. I found her this morning when I went to check on her." The words didn't make sense at first. Passed away. Linda. My Linda, who I'd spoken to just 3 days ago, who'd cried on the phone about being shut out by her family, who I'd promised to call back. What happened? My voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. "The coroner said it was a heart attack. She died in her sleep, alone." Carol's voice cracked. "No one was with her, Nancy. No one." I thanked her for calling and hung up. Then I sat there staring at the phone in my hand, trying to breathe. I'd left Linda a voicemail on Christmas Eve. She'd never called me back. And now I knew why. I grabbed my coat and drove to Linda's house in a daze. When I arrived, there were 2 police cars parked outside and a coroner's van. Carol met me at the door, her eyes red from crying. She led me inside, but they wouldn't let me see Linda. Not yet. The scene was devastatingly quiet. No family rushing in. No frantic children demanding answers. Just a few officials doing their jobs, and an old woman who'd died alone in the home she'd lived in for 40 years. I stood in Linda's living room surrounded by the remnants of her life. Christmas decorations she'd put up herself. Photos of her sons on the mantel, smiling faces frozen in time. A plate of cookies on the kitchen counter untouched, probably baked for grandchildren who never came. The funeral was held 3 days later at a small chapel on the edge of town. I arrived early, expecting a crowd. Linda had been involved in the community. She'd volunteered at the library. She'd baked for church events. Surely people would come. But when the service started, there were only 7 of us. 7 elderly women who'd known Linda through book clubs and potlucks and quiet afternoons drinking tea. Her sons didn't come. Her daughter-in-law didn't come. They sent a wreath with a card that read, "With sympathy," signed with their names in impersonal print. I stood before the casket during the viewing, looking down at Linda's face. She looked peaceful, but also smaller somehow, as if death had diminished her. I saw myself reflected in her stillness. The same gray hair, the same lines around the eyes, the same life spent giving to people who didn't give back. One of the women, Helen, stood beside me and whispered, "She spent her whole life giving and died waiting for a phone call that never came." The words pierced me. I thought about my voicemail. "Linda, it's Nancy. I need to talk to you. Call me when you can." That was the last thing she would have heard from me, a request. Not comfort, not love, just another person needing something from her. I realized then that my unanswered call was Linda's last chance to hear a kind voice, and she'd died before she could call me back. That night I sat alone in my living room scrolling through photos on my phone. I found one of Linda and me from last summer, taken at a church picnic. We were both smiling, arms around each other, faces bright with laughter. She'd been alive then, happy, or at least pretending to be. And now she was gone. I walked to my bathroom and pulled a piece of paper from the drawer. With a black marker, I wrote in large, deliberate letters, $3,270, the price I paid to learn I'm worth more than this. I taped it to my mirror right at eye level so I'd see it every single day. Then I said aloud to the empty house, to Linda's memory, to myself, "I won't die being disrespected. I will teach them what respect means." I went to the hall closet and pulled down the box of old documents I'd been avoiding for years. I spread them across the kitchen table. The contract from the house sale signed in my shaky handwriting 5 years ago. Ethan's college tuition receipts, thousands of dollars I'd scraped together working myself to exhaustion. Letters from Robert written before he died, telling me how proud he was of the mother I'd become. I sat there for hours, reading through the evidence of my life. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment I'd put Ethan's needs above my own. And for what? So he could laugh at me in a crowded restaurant. So he could plan my humiliation with a waiter. I thought about Linda lying alone in her house, her heart giving out while her children lived 20 miles away and couldn't be bothered to visit. I thought about the empty funeral, the cold wreath, the life spent waiting for love that never came. I wasn't going to end up like that. I couldn't. Linda's death didn't break me. It woke me up. And when a mother wakes up, the world better be ready. The day after Linda's funeral, I woke up with a strange sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The note on my mirror stared back at me as I brushed my teeth. $3,270, the price I'd paid to finally see the truth. I made coffee and sat down at the kitchen table with the box of documents I'd pulled out the night before. I spent the entire morning going through them piece by piece. The house sale contract was there, yellowed at the edges, my signature at the bottom next to Robert's photo. I ran my fingers over the date. 5 years ago. I'd walked away from the home where I'd built my entire life, and Ethan had never even asked how I managed it. There were tuition receipts carefully filed and labeled. $23,000 for his freshman year. $25,000 for sophomore. On and on, year after year, bleeding me dry while I worked overtime and skipped meals to make ends meet. There were letters from Robert written in the last months of his life telling me how proud he was of the mother I'd become, how Ethan would grow up to be a good man because of me. I looked at the family photos scattered across the table. Ethan as a baby, chubby and smiling. Ethan at 10, holding a trophy from Little League. Ethan at his college graduation, standing between Amanda and me, his arm around her waist, barely touching my shoulder. In every photo I was there, present, smiling, giving. And then I realized something that should have been obvious all along. I gave everything, but I forgot to keep something for myself. That afternoon I called a realtor. My house was small, but it was in a decent neighborhood. With the market the way it was, I could sell it and move into something even smaller, something cheaper, and finally have money left over. Money for me. Not for Ethan. Not for anyone else. Just me. I also called my lawyer and rewrote my will. Whatever I had left when I died would go to charity, to organizations that helped widows and single mothers, to people who actually needed it. Ethan's name was removed entirely. In January, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I applied for a part-time job at the local library, not because I needed the money desperately, but because I needed to be around people again, around life. The head librarian, a woman named Margaret with kind eyes and silver hair, hired me on the spot. I started shelving books 3 days a week, and it felt like stepping into a different world. I met women my own age, women who'd also spent their lives raising children and were now figuring out who they were without them. We talked over coffee in the break room. We laughed. I joined a book club that met every other Tuesday. I even signed up for a yoga class at the community center, something Amanda would have mocked mercilessly. And then there was George. He was a regular at the library, a retired carpenter who volunteered to repair broken shelves and squeaky chairs. He was 67, soft-spoken with calloused hands and a gentle smile. We started talking one afternoon when he asked if I'd read the mystery novel I was shelving. That conversation turned into coffee. Coffee turned into walks around the park. Walks turned into long talks about books and life and the strangeness of starting over in your 60s. George never asked me for anything. He just listened. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt light. 2 months after Christmas, on a cold February morning, my phone rang. I was at the library laughing with Margaret about a patron who'd tried to check out a decorative book that was glued to the shelf. I glanced at the screen and saw Ethan's name. My first instinct was to ignore it. But something made me answer. "Mom!" His voice was raw, broken. He was crying. "Mom, I need your help." I stepped outside into the cold, my breath fogging in the air. "What's wrong, Ethan?" "Everything. Everything's wrong." He was sobbing now, barely able to get the words out. "The company, the IRS, has been investigating us since November. I didn't think it was serious, but it is. We owe so much in back taxes, Mom. We're bankrupt. I'm going to lose everything." I stood there leaning against the brick wall of the library, listening to my son fall apart. "And Amanda." His voice cracked. "She filed for divorce in January. She left. She knew this was coming and she just left. I'm alone, Mom. I don't know what to do. You're the only one I have left." There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing, waiting for me to say what I'd always said before. "It's okay. I'll help. I'll fix it." But I didn't say that. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice small and desperate. "Please." I looked up at the gray winter sky, snow beginning to fall in soft flakes. Inside the library, through the window, I could see George repairing a chair, his steady hands working with care. I thought about Linda's empty funeral. I thought about the note on my mirror. "Come by tomorrow," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you." "I knew you'd—" "Tomorrow," I repeated, and hung up. I stood there for a moment, phone in hand, staring at the falling snow. I heard my son's voice breaking, and for the first time in my life, I didn't rush to save him. Ethan arrived at my door at exactly 2 o'clock the next afternoon. I'd spent the morning at the library, then come home and made a simple pot of chicken soup. Nothing fancy, just vegetables, broth, and shredded chicken, the kind of meal I used to make when he was sick as a child. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. He'd aged years in the 2 months since Christmas. His face was drawn new lines carved around his mouth and eyes. Gray streaked through his hair at the temples, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He wore jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt, no coat, despite the cold. He looked smaller, somehow diminished. "Hi, Mom." His voice was hoarse. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. He walked past me into the house, glancing around as if seeing it for the first time. I suppose, in a way, he was. How many times had he actually visited in the past 5 years, 3, 4? And even then, he'd barely stayed long enough to finish a cup of coffee. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the kitchen table. "I made soup." He sat, and I ladled the soup into 2 bowls, placed them on the table, along with toast and butter. Nothing elaborate, nothing designed to impress or please. Just food. Ethan stared at his bowl, then at me. I could see the confusion in his eyes. He'd expected me to fuss over him, to ask a dozen questions, to immediately start problem-solving. Instead, I sat down across from him, picked up my spoon, and began to eat. "Mom." He started, his voice tentative. "Eat first," I said calmly. "Then we'll talk." We ate in silence. I watched him struggle with it, the quiet, the lack of urgency, the absence of the mother he thought he knew. When we finished, I collected the bowls and set them in the sink. Then I sat back down and folded my hands on the table. "Ethan," I said, my voice steady, "do you remember what you said to me at that restaurant?" He looked down at his hands. "Mom, do you remember?" "Yes." His voice was barely a whisper. "What did you say?" He swallowed hard. "I said you should cover the bill as your Christmas gift to us." And do you remember what happened next? He nodded, still not looking at me. Everyone laughed. Yes, they did. I paused, letting the memory settle between us. I paid that bill, Ethan. $3,270. I paid it with a credit card that's now maxed out. But I also paid a price you'll never see on paper. He finally looked up, and I saw tears brimming in his eyes. Mom, I know I was wrong. Amanda pushed me to do it. She said it would be funny, that you wouldn't mind that you'd always helped us before. I was trying to impress her friends. I was stupid. So you chose to impress strangers over respecting your mother. The question hung in the air like a blade. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. I wasn't thinking. No, I agreed. You weren't. But Amanda didn't make you do it, Ethan. You chose it. You called the restaurant ahead of time and told them to give me the bill. You planned it. His face crumpled. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. And now everything's falling apart and I need your help and I know I don't deserve it, but you're right, I interrupted. You don't deserve it. He stared at me, shocked. I'd never said anything like that to him before. I'd always softened the blow, made excuses, found ways to let him off the hook. I stood up and walked to the counter where I'd placed a sealed envelope that morning. I picked it up and returned to the table, setting it in front of him. What's this? He asked. Open it when you truly understand what respect means. He reached for it, but I placed my hand over his. Not now. Later. When you've earned it. Mom, I need money now. The bankruptcy, the lawyers, I'm drowning here. Can you please just no? The word was quiet, but final. He stared at me like I'd slapped him. No, he repeated, disbelief in his voice. No, not until you learn. You're welcome to stay for dinner if you'd like. You can even stay here temporarily while you figure things out. But I won't give you what you haven't earned. But I'm your son. Yes, and I'm your mother. And for your entire life, I've given you everything you asked for. I worked myself to exhaustion. I sold my home. I emptied my savings. And you thanked me by humiliating me in public. I leaned forward, my voice still calm but firm. You'll need to find your own way out of this, Ethan. Not because I don't love you, but because love doesn't mean enabling you to stay the person who hurt me. He sat there trembling, staring at the envelope like it might contain all the answers he desperately needed. But I knew what was inside, and I knew he wasn't ready to see it yet. I have to go to work, I said, standing up. Lock the door when you leave. I grabbed my coat and purse and walked out, leaving him sitting at my kitchen table alone with his thoughts and an envelope he couldn't open. As I drove to the library, I thought about the look on his face, the confusion, the hurt, the dawning realization that I wasn't going to save him the way I always had. He thought I was punishing him. I was only giving him a mirror. I didn't hear from Ethan for a week. 7 days of silence. Part of me wondered if he'd simply left, if he'd given up and moved on to find someone else to rescue him. But another part of me, the part that still knew my son, despite everything, suspected he was sitting somewhere with that envelope, too afraid to open it. I was right. It was late on a Tuesday evening when my phone rang. I was curled up on the couch with a book George had recommended, a cup of tea growing cold on the side table. When I saw Ethan's name on the screen, my heart didn't race the way it used to. I just set the book down and answered. Mom? His voice was wrecked raw from crying. Why didn't you tell me you sold the house? So he'd opened it. Finally. Hello, Ethan. The house, Mom. Our house. The one where Dad died. The one where I grew up. You sold it to give me money for the apartment, didn't you? I took a slow breath. Yes. But you told me you had savings. You said it was money you'd set aside. I know what I said. Why would you lie? His voice broke. Why wouldn't you tell me the truth? I closed my eyes, remembering that day 5 years ago. Standing in the empty living room, everything packed and gone, just me and the walls that held every memory of my life with Robert. I'd held his photo in my hands, the one from our wedding day, and whispered to him like he could still hear me. Honey, I'm doing this for our son. He needs this more than I need memories. I'd signed the papers that afternoon. The realtor had asked if I was sure, noticing the tears streaming down my face. I told her I was. And I'd meant it. I walked away from that house carrying only a small box of photos, leaving behind every piece of furniture, every dish, every curtain, because the new owners wanted it furnished and were willing to pay more for it. Because a mother's love doesn't beg to be seen, I said quietly into the phone. But it does break when it's ignored. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear him breathing, uneven and shaky. I thought you just had money, he whispered. I thought it was easy for you. I didn't realize. I know you didn't. All this time while I was living in that apartment, showing it off to Amanda's friends, bragging about the view and the amenities, you were here, in this tiny house. Alone. His voice cracked. And I never even asked how you managed it. I just took the money and said thank you like it was nothing. I heard something crash on his end, like he'd knocked something over. Then I heard him sobbing, deep and guttural, the kind of crying that comes from a place of complete devastation. Ethan, at the restaurant, when I made you pay that bill, when Amanda and I laughed, he couldn't finish. You gave up everything for me. Everything. And I repaid you by humiliating you in front of strangers. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I could say that he didn't already know. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I know. Can I come see you? Please, I need to see you. Not tonight, I said gently. Tonight I need you to sit with this. Really sit with it. Understand what it means. I do understand. No, you don't. Not yet. But you will. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. This was the hardest thing I'd ever done, harder even than selling the house, because every instinct I had was screaming at me to comfort him, to tell him it was okay to rush to his side and make the pain go away. But I didn't, because that's what had gotten us here in the first place. I picked up my book again, but I couldn't focus on the words. Instead, I found myself remembering that last day at the old house. I'd walked through every room one final time, touching the walls, the door frames, the windowsills. I'd stood in the bedroom where Robert had died, where I'd held his hand and felt his last breath against my cheek. I'd whispered goodbye to all of it. And then I'd walked out and never looked back, because I believed I was doing the right thing. I believed my son would appreciate it someday. I believed love and sacrifice were the same thing. Now, 5 years later, sitting in my small living room with my cold tea and borrowed book, I understood something I hadn't then. Love and sacrifice aren't the same thing. Love requires respect. And respect requires seeing the person in front of you as whole, as valuable, as worthy of consideration. Ethan had never seen me that way. He'd seen me as Mom, as a resource, as someone who existed to meet his needs. But maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see something different now. For the first time, my son saw me not as a mother, but as a woman who had given up her whole world for him. The call came on a Thursday morning in early March. I was at the library helping a patron find books on woodworking when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to step outside and answer it. Nancy. The voice was soft, tentative, almost sweet. It took me a moment to place it. Amanda. Yes. I'm sorry to bother you. I heard Ethan came to see you a few weeks ago. I wanted to reach out because, well, I'm sorry for everything. I stood in the cold March air, watching my breath form clouds, and said nothing. Nancy, can we talk? I know I don't deserve it, but I want to make things right. I was wrong about so many things. What do you want, Amanda? There was a pause. I want to help Ethan. He's struggling and I feel responsible. Can I come see you? Please. I should have said no. Should have hung up. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see what game she was playing now. Tomorrow afternoon, 2:00. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you so much. When Amanda arrived the next day, I barely recognized her. Gone were the designer clothes and perfect hair. She wore simple jeans and a plain sweater, minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked younger this way, almost vulnerable. She stood on my porch, holding a small bouquet of grocery store flowers. Thank you for seeing me, she said as I let her in. I took the flowers without comment and set them on the counter. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd left Ethan with the envelope, and I waited for her to speak. I know I was terrible to you, she began, her hands clasped in her lap. The restaurant, the way I treated you, all of it. I was caught up in appearances and status, and I lost sight of what really matters. And what really matters, Amanda. Family. Ethan. He's going through hell right now, and even though we're divorcing, I still care about him. He needs help, Nancy. He needs us both. I studied her face. She was good at this, the performance of sincerity. Her eyes were wide and earnest, her voice soft and apologetic. What kind of help? She leaned forward slightly. I have a plan. A friend of mine runs an investment firm and he's willing to give Ethan a chance to restart his business if we can come up with $50,000 as seed money. It's a real opportunity, Nancy. A way for him to get back on his feet. She pulled papers from her bag, glossy brochures, business plans, with charts and projections. It all looked legitimate, sophisticated, convincing. Nancy, can you lend me, us $50,000? I'll pay you back. I promise. This is Ethan's chance. I looked at the papers, then at her. Amanda, I know about your first mother-in-law. Her face went pale. What? I know she took your son away from you in the custody battle, and I know you're afraid I'll do the same to Ethan. Her mouth opened closed. Tears welled in her eyes, real ones this time. How do you... It doesn't matter how I know. Tell me what happened. She looked down at her hands, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She turned everyone against me, told the court I was unstable, that I wasn't fit to be a mother. She had money influence, and I had nothing. They took my son. I lost everything. For the first time since she'd arrived, I saw something genuine in her. Pain. Deep, raw pain that I recognized because I'd felt it myself. I'm sorry that happened to you, I said quietly. Truly. No mother should lose her child that way. She wiped her eyes. When I married Ethan, I was so afraid you'd be like her, that you'd try to control us, interfere, take him away from me. So I pushed you out first. I thought if I could make him choose me over you, I'd be safe. I'm not her Amanda. I would never do that. I know, she whispered. I know that now. But I also won't let you use my son as a meal ticket. Her head snapped up. That's not what isn't it? I stood and walked to my desk, pulled out my checkbook. I wrote out a check for $50,000, dated it, signed it. Then I flipped it over and wrote in small letters on the back. Fraud test Nancy Williams. I handed it to her. She looked at it, her eyes widening at the amount, not noticing the notation on the back. Thank you, she breathed. Thank you so much. You won't regret this. We'll see. After she left, I stood at the window watching her car disappear down the street. I knew exactly what she'd do with that check, and I knew exactly what would happen when she tried to cash it. She thought I was giving her money. I was only showing her the truth about herself. The next morning, I called Amanda. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright and eager. "Nancy, hi, I was just about to head to the bank. Before you do that, why don't you come by? I want to discuss how we can help Ethan properly. Make sure this investment is sound." There was a brief pause. "Of course, that's smart. When should I come?" "How about in an hour?" "Perfect. See you then." After I hung up, I went to my bedroom and retrieved the small digital recorder I'd bought years ago for keeping voice notes when I did freelance accounting work. Minnesota law allowed single-party consent for recording conversations, something I'd learned during my career. I tested it, made sure it was working, then slipped it into my cardigan pocket. When Amanda arrived, she looked more confident than she had the day before. The vulnerable act had served its purpose. Now she was here to seal the deal. We sat at the kitchen table again, and I poured us both coffee. "I've been thinking about this investment," I said carefully. "It's a lot of money." "I know, and I'm so grateful. This is going to change everything for Ethan." "Amanda, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." "If Ethan never recovers financially, would you still want to be with him?" She blinked clearly, not expecting the question. Then she laughed, a short, practiced sound. "Nancy, love doesn't pay bills. Ethan had money. Now he doesn't. That's just reality. So money is what matters." "Of course it matters. You can't live on love alone. You should know that better than anyone." "What do you mean?" She leaned back in her chair, comfortable now, thinking she was among someone who understood. "Come on, Nancy. You did everything for money, too." "Right. You sold that house, worked those jobs. All of it was about securing Ethan's financial future. You sacrificed for money, just like I'm trying to secure it now." "So you never loved him?" Amanda shrugged. "I loved what he could give me. That's how marriage works, isn't it? Partnership. Exchange. He got a beautiful wife who made him look successful, and I got security. Or at least I did, until his company collapsed." I kept my face neutral, even as disgust churned in my stomach. "And now you want my money to restart that arrangement. I want to help him recover so we can both benefit. That's just smart, Nancy." I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gray March morning. "Thank you for being honest." "So we're good. I can go to the bank." "Yes, you should definitely try to cash that check." After she left, I took the recorder from my pocket and transferred the audio file to my computer. Then I composed an email to Ethan with the subject line, "The truth you need to hear." I attached the file and typed a brief message. "Your ex-wife came to me asking for $50,000. I gave her a check she can't cash. But before you hear from her, you should hear this." I hit send. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was Amanda, her voice shaking with fury. "What the hell, Nancy? The bank wouldn't take your check. They said it was post-dated and flagged." I didn't answer. I just hung up and turned my phone to silent. That evening, Ethan called. His voice was hollow. I listened to the recording. "I thought you should know the truth. All this time, she was just using me. Using both of us." "Yes. She came here this afternoon," he said quietly. "Tried to explain, said you misunderstood that she really does care about me." "What did you say?" I played her the recording. His voice broke. I asked her if it was true, if she really said those things. She tried to backtrack, said it came out wrong, that she was just being practical. But I saw it in her eyes, Mom. She wasn't sorry she said it. She was sorry she got caught. "I'm sorry you had to hear it that way." "No, I needed to hear it. I needed to know." He took a shaky breath. "I told her to leave. She tried to argue, said she needed that money, that we had plans. And I realized she wasn't talking about helping me. She was talking about helping herself. So I opened the door and told her to get out. Told her never to contact you or me again." "How do you feel?" "Empty, angry, Stupid. He paused. But also clear for the first time in years. She made me into someone I'm ashamed of. She pushed me to humiliate you, to treat you like you were worthless, and I let her because I wanted to be the person she pretended to love. You're not that person anymore, Ethan. I hope not. His voice was small. I hope I can be better. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my living room and thought about Amanda, about the fear and pain that had twisted her into someone who could only see relationships as transactions, about how her first mother-in-law's cruelty had taught her that love was a weapon and vulnerability was weakness. I felt sorry for her truly, but I also knew she would have destroyed my son completely if I'd let her. And just like that, the woman who made me feel small became nothing but a shadow walking out the door. I thought it was over. Amanda had left. Ethan was beginning to understand what I'd sacrificed, and I could finally return to the quiet life I'd been building. But I'd underestimated how dangerous humiliation can make a desperate person. 3 days after Ethan threw Amanda out, I woke to 17 missed calls and a dozen text messages. The first one I opened was from Margaret at the library. "Nancy, are you okay? I saw what's going around on Facebook." My stomach dropped. I didn't use social media much. I had an account, I barely checked, but I logged in and immediately saw what everyone was talking about. Amanda had posted a long status that had been shared dozens of times throughout our small community. "Beware of toxic mothers-in-law who manipulate their sons and extort money while playing the victim," it read. "Some women spend their whole lives controlling their children, then act wounded when they're finally held accountable. My ex-husband's mother is a master manipulator who guilt-tripped her way into our lives and our finances, then played the martyr when we set boundaries. Don't let these narcissistic mothers fool you." Toxic family. Narcissistic mothers. Protect yourself. The post had 63 comments. People I'd never met were weighing in, some defending Amanda, others asking questions. A few people I knew from church had commented with concerned messages. "Is this about Nancy Williams? And I always thought she seemed so nice." My hands shook as I scrolled through the comments. At the grocery store later that morning, I felt eyes on me. The cashier who usually chatted with me looked away. A neighbor I'd waved to for years hurried past without acknowledgement. By afternoon, I'd received several messages from acquaintances. "Is everything okay, Nancy? We heard about the situation." Each one was carefully worded, probing, looking for my side, but already tinged with doubt. That evening, my phone rang. It was Helen, a retired lawyer I knew from the book club. "Nancy, I saw what Amanda posted. You should sue her for defamation. This is textbook libel." "I don't want to sue anyone, Helen. But she's destroying your reputation. The whole town is talking about it. Let them talk. Nancy." "I don't need a court to prove my truth, Helen. I just need to show it." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time thinking. I could feel the old Nancy trying to surface, the one who stayed quiet, who absorbed attacks, who believed that defending herself was somehow selfish or aggressive. But that Nancy was gone. I opened the drawer where I'd kept the receipt from Christmas dinner. I'd saved it, though I wasn't sure why at the time. Now I knew. I took a photo of it, the numbers clear and stark. $3 and two $70. Then I opened Facebook and began to type. This was my Christmas gift to my son's family at a restaurant where I was seated at the edge of the table. I never asked for thanks. I only asked for respect. I paid this bill with love. Love that was laughed at. But I don't regret paying it, because it taught me the most valuable lesson: I am worth more than how anyone treats me. I posted the photo with the caption, "No accusations, no naming Amanda, no anger. Just the simple, undeniable truth." Within an hour, the post had 40 comments, then 60, then over 100. People I'd worked with decades ago came out of the woodwork. Neighbors who'd witnessed my quiet kindness over the years spoke up. Margaret from the library wrote, "Nancy is one of the most genuine, selfless people I know. Anyone who knows her really knows her understands that." And then Ethan commented, "Mom, I'm sorry. You deserved better than what I gave you that night, and every day I let someone make you feel less than you are. I was wrong. And I will spend the rest of my life proving I've learned what you tried to teach me." The tide turned immediately. People who'd been suspicious began apologizing. The narrative shifted. Within hours, someone found Amanda's post and screenshot it before she could delete it, posting it alongside mine with the comment, "Looks like there are two sides to every story." By the next morning, Amanda had deleted her post, then her entire account. I heard through the grapevine that she'd left town entirely, staying with a friend in another state. But something else happened that I hadn't expected. Other mothers started reaching out. Women my age, some older, some younger, all with similar stories. Sons and daughters who'd grown distant. In-laws who'd pushed them aside. Years of sacrifice met with indifference or contempt. One woman, Carol, sent me a private message. "I thought I was the only one. My daughter hasn't called in 2 years. Seeing your post made me realize I'm not crazy for feeling hurt. Thank you." Another wrote, "You taught me something important today, that standing up for yourself isn't the same as being selfish. Thank you for your courage." I didn't feel courageous. I just felt tired. Tired of hiding, tired of shrinking, tired of letting other people's cruelty define my worth. George came over that evening with takeout and sat with me while I read through the messages. "You did good," he said quietly. "I just told the truth. That's all you ever needed to do." He was right. The truth didn't need to shout. It just needed to be seen. And once it was, nothing could hide anymore. It was late afternoon on a Saturday when I heard the knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. George had gone to visit his daughter for the weekend, and Margaret was at a conference. I set down the book I was reading and walked to the door. When I opened it, Ethan stood on my porch. He wasn't wearing a coat despite the March chill. In his hands, he held a small bunch of wildflowers, dandelions, clover, a few early crocuses, the kind of scraggly bouquet a child picks from the roadside. The kind he used to bring me when he was 7 years old, running up the driveway with dirt on his knees and pride in his eyes. I looked at him and saw that he'd been crying. His eyes were red and swollen, his face pale. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke immediately. Before I could respond, he dropped to his knees right there on my front porch, the flowers falling from his hands. "Mom, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know I finally see what I did." I stood frozen, looking down at my son kneeling before me. Part of me wanted to pull him up immediately to tell him it was okay to fall back into the old pattern of soothing and protecting. But I didn't move. I waited. "I was ashamed of you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not because of who you are, but because I was ashamed of myself. I was ashamed that I came from a small house, that we didn't have money, that you worked 2 jobs and drove an old car. Amanda made me believe that success meant leaving the past behind, and I was weak enough to think you were part of that past." Tears streamed down his face. "I forgot that you are my foundation. Without you, I'm nothing. I built my entire life on your sacrifices and then pretended they never happened. I pretended you were just this woman who existed to help me, not a person who gave up everything." He looked up at me, then his eyes desperate. "When you sold that house, Mom, that was your home with Dad. That was your history, your memories, everything you had left of him. And I took it without even asking what it cost you. I just took it and said thank you, like you'd given me a gift card." His voice cracked completely. "That restaurant. making you pay that bill, laughing at you. Mom, I let everyone laugh at you. The woman who gave up her entire world so I could have one. I knelt down then slowly until I was level with him. I cupped his face in my hands and made him look at me. Ethan, you don't owe me money. You owe yourself the courage to be the man I raised you to be. I don't know if I can be that man. Yes, you can. Because he's still in there. He's been there all along, just buried under fear and shame and the need to impress people who didn't matter. I helped him stand, and then I did what I'd been holding back from doing for months. I pulled him into my arms and held him tight. He collapsed against me, sobbing like a child, and I let him. I didn't tell him to stop or calm down or be strong. I just held him. After a long time, we went inside. I picked up the wildflowers from the porch and put them in a glass of water. Then I made tea and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where so many difficult conversations had happened over the past few months. But this time was different. This time there was no envelope, no conditions, no walls between us, just mother and son. Tell me about Dad, Ethan said quietly. Tell me about the house. I don't think I ever really asked. So I did. I told him about the day Robert and I bought that house, how we'd scraped together the down payment, how we'd painted every room ourselves. I told him about the garden Robert planted in the backyard, how he'd wanted to grow vegetables, but only managed tomatoes and one stubborn pumpkin. I told him about the night Robert died, how he'd held my hand and told me to take care of our boy. He'd be so disappointed in me, Ethan whispered. No. He'd be proud that you're finally learning what really matters. We talked for hours long after the tea went cold and the sun set outside the window. We talked about his childhood, about the years after Robert died, about Amanda, and the slow way she'd convinced him that I was somehow less than. We talked about the restaurant and the shame he'd felt, even as he laughed the way he'd known it was wrong, but did it anyway. I don't want you to spend your life feeling guilty, I finally said. I want you to spend it being better. How do I do that? You start by being honest with yourself, with me, with everyone. And you stop measuring your worth by what other people think of you. He nodded, wiping his eyes. Can we start over? Not forget what happened, but just try again. We're not starting over, Ethan. We're starting forward. With the truth between us this time. He reached across the table and took my hand. His fingers were cold, but his grip was firm. I love you, Mom. I don't think I've said that in years, not really meant it. But I love you. I know, I said softly. I never stopped knowing that. I just needed you to know it too. That night I didn't get my son back. I got the son I always knew he could be, and he finally found the mother he'd forgotten. Connection from part 13. The previous section ended with that night I didn't get my son back. I got the son I always knew he could be, and he finally found the mother he'd forgotten. Current context. After the emotional reconciliation, Nancy and Ethan are in a new phase of their relationship. The air has been cleared, but Nancy knows that words alone won't rebuild what was broken. Action and time are required. She is committed to not falling back into old patterns where she rescues Ethan from every difficulty. She loves him, but she also loves herself now. And she understands that true love sometimes means letting people struggle so they can grow. Meanwhile, her relationship with George has been deepening, and she is discovering what it means to be loved without being needed to be valued as a whole person rather than just as a caretaker. The next few months will test whether Ethan can truly change and whether Nancy can maintain her boundaries while still being present as a mother. 2 weeks after our long conversation at the kitchen table, Ethan called to tell me he was selling the apartment. The luxury condo downtown, the one I'd helped him by selling my home with Robert. He'd found a buyer willing to take it as is, despite the market being difficult. I'm moving into a small rental, he said. It's about 10 minutes from you, nothing fancy. 1 bedroom, but it's clean and affordable. That sounds like a good decision. Mom, with the money from the sale, I can pay off most of my debts. But there's still about 15,000 left. I was wondering if… No. Silence on the other end. Ethan, I won't save you anymore. You need to save yourself. But I'm trying, I'm really trying. I know you are, and I'm proud of you for that. But if I give you money now, I'll be taking away the lesson you need to learn. You have to do this on your own. His voice was small. Okay? Come over this weekend. Bring your bills and your bank statements. We'll create a financial plan together. That Saturday, we sat at my kitchen table with everything spread out before us. I taught him what I knew from my years as an accountant: how to budget, how to prioritize debts, how to negotiate with creditors. I showed him how to cut expenses without sacrificing dignity. But I didn't give him a single dollar. A mother's job is to teach you to stand, not to carry you forever, I told him. He nodded, and I could see he was really listening this time. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found work as a junior accountant at a small firm. Nothing glamorous, a fraction of what he'd made before, but honest work. He took a second job on weekends doing bookkeeping for local businesses. He moved into his small rental apartment with secondhand furniture and learned to cook simple meals instead of ordering takeout. Every few evenings he'd come to my house for dinner. But now he was the one cooking. He'd bring groceries and prepare meals while I sat at the table reading or doing crosswords. He'd wash the dishes, take out the trash, fix the loose handle on my cabinet that had been broken for months. You don't have to do all this, I told him one evening. I know, but I want to. One night in April, George came over for dinner while Ethan was there. I'd mentioned George before, but they'd never met. I was nervous about it, unsure how Ethan would react to seeing another man in his late father's place. But Ethan stood up immediately and extended his hand. You must be George. Mom's told me about you. George shook his hand warmly. And you must be Ethan. I've heard a lot about you too. We ate together George's homemade lasagna, Ethan's salad, my bread. The conversation flowed easily. George asked Ethan about his work, and Ethan asked George about carpentry. I sat there watching them, these two men who both cared about me, talking like old friends. After dinner, Ethan helped clean up, while George and I sat in the living room. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see my son washing dishes, humming softly to himself. He looked lighter somehow, despite working 2 jobs and living in a tiny apartment. He looked free. Later, as Ethan was leaving, George walked him to the door. I heard George say quietly, Your mother is an extraordinary woman. She deserves to be treated like one. I know, Ethan replied. I'm finally starting to understand that. After Ethan left, George and I sat on the porch, watching the spring evening settle in. He's a good man, George said. He just needed to find his way back to himself. He's learning. So are you. George took my hand. You're learning that you can love someone without losing yourself. That's not easy. He was right. For so many years, I'd believed that being a good mother meant disappearing into the role, erasing my own needs and desires. But watching Ethan rebuild his life without my money, watching him struggle and succeed on his own terms, I realized something profound. I could be proud of him without being responsible for him. I could love him without sacrificing myself. And I could build a life of my own with friends, with purpose, and yes, with George, without guilt or shame. One evening, Ethan came over and found George and me laughing over a card game. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching. When I looked up, he was smiling a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen since he was a child. What? I asked. Nothing. I just realized I've never seen you this happy. Not in all these years. I'm happy because I'm finally living for myself, I said gently. Not because I stopped loving you. but because I started loving me too." He nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "I never saw you as a whole person before, did I? Just as my mom. Someone who existed to take care of me. That's changing now." "Yeah, it is." My son was learning to walk again, and I was learning to live, not for him, but for me. When Ethan asked if he could host Christmas at my house this year, I said yes immediately, not because I wanted to relive the past, but because I knew this would be different. Everything was different now. He arrived early on Christmas Eve with George, the two of them carrying boxes of decorations and groceries. They'd been planning this together for weeks, and I'd been forbidden from helping. I sat in my armchair with tea, watching them string lights around the windows and hang a simple wreath on the door. Nothing extravagant, nothing meant to impress, just warm and genuine the way Christmas should be. "Mom, where do you want the tree?" Ethan called from the living room. "Wherever you think it looks best." He and George debated for a moment before settling it in the corner by the window, exactly where Robert and I used to put it. When they finished decorating, stepping back to admire their work, I felt something shift in my chest. This was what home was supposed to feel like. By evening, the house was full. Margaret from the library came with her husband. Helen, my lawyer friend from book club, arrived with homemade cookies. Carol, the neighbor who'd found Linda, brought her daughter. Even a few of the mothers who'd reached out to me after the Facebook post were there, women I'd never met before that day, but who'd become part of my circle since then. The dining table we'd set up was modest, the food simple but plentiful. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread. Nothing that cost $3,000. As everyone gathered, I noticed something unusual. There was an extra chair at the table, empty, with a small sign propped against it. I walked closer and read the words written in Ethan's careful handwriting. "For Linda and all the mothers who waited for respect that never came." My throat tightened. I looked at Ethan, and he nodded. Before we sat down to eat, he asked for everyone's attention. The room fell quiet, and he stood beside the empty chair, his hand resting on its back. "I want to tell you about this chair," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "It's here for Linda, my mother's best friend, who died alone last year, waiting for her family to value her. But it's also here as a reminder. This chair represents my mother. It represents the place she almost lost at our family table. Not because she left, but because I pushed her away." He looked at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. "Linda died waiting for a call that never came. I almost let my mother die the same way, not physically, but in every way that matters. I let someone convince me that the woman who sacrificed everything for me was somehow less important than appearances and money and impressing people who didn't matter." Several women in the room were crying now. I saw Carol reach for a tissue. Margaret gripped her husband's hand. "This chair will always be here," Ethan continued. "Not to make us sad, but to remind us. To remind me that respect isn't optional, that love without dignity isn't really love at all, and that the people who give us everything deserve to be treated like they matter." He looked around the room. "If you have a mother, a father, someone who loved you when you couldn't love yourself, don't let them become an empty chair. Don't wait until it's too late." There was a long moment of silence. Then everyone sat down, and I found myself in the center seat, right at the head of the table where I belonged. George sat to my right, Ethan to my left. The empty chair remained a quiet presence among us. As we began to eat, Carol leaned over and whispered to me, "Thank you, Nancy. I needed to see this. I needed to know it's possible to stand up for yourself and not lose everything." Across the table, I saw one of the younger women whisper something to the man beside her. Her son, I realized. He looked down ashamed, then reached over and took his mother's hand. She started crying, and he hugged her. After dinner, as we were clearing plates, Ethan handed me a card. I opened it and read, $3,270, the cost of a lesson I'll never forget. Thank you for teaching me the price of respect. I looked at him, then carefully tore the card in half. Keep the memory, not the guilt. You've already paid by becoming the man you are today. He pulled me into a hug, and I held my son, feeling the weight of the past year, all the pain, all the growth, all the healing, settle into something like peace. George stood and raised his glass. To Nancy and to all the mothers who taught us that love should never come at the cost of dignity. Everyone raised their glasses. To Nancy, they echoed. I looked around the table at these people who saw me. Really saw me not as someone who existed to serve, but as someone worthy of love and respect just for being myself. The empty chair sat among us, a testament to what had been lost and what had been saved. Because sometimes revenge isn't about making them pay. It's about teaching them to see. And when they finally do, you realize you've won something far greater than justice. You've won yourself back. And in doing so, you've shown others they can too. Closing call to action. So that's my story. The story of how a $3,000 Christmas dinner taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, that I am worth more than how anyone treats me. It taught my son what respect truly means. And somehow it became a story that resonated with hundreds of mothers who reached out to tell me they'd felt invisible too, that they'd given everything and received nothing in return. If my story touched you today, if you saw yourself or your mother or someone you love in what I shared, I want to ask you something. Don't let this be just another story you heard and forgot. Let it be a catalyst for change. If you're a mother who's been disrespected, know that you deserve better. If you're a son or daughter who's taken someone for granted, it's not too late to make it right. And if you've ever felt small, invisible, or worthless because of how someone treated you, remember this: your worth isn't determined by their blindness. I'd love to hear your story. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself? What did you do? How did it turn out? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you found value in this story, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. I share real stories about real people navigating the complicated terrain of family love and self-respect. Every subscription tells me that these stories matter, that we're building a community where people don't have to shrink themselves to fit into someone else's life. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, you are never too old, too tired, or too far gone to reclaim your dignity. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's becoming the person you were always meant to be. Until next time, take care of yourself. You're worth it.